Good afternoon, everyone. Could you please take your seats? It's 12:30. Well, welcome to you all who have braved the Place des Nations and the Gilets jaunes. I don't know how many ended up at the Place des Nations. They thought about having 8,000, but given the size of the audience today, I think it wasn't much of a commotion. My name is Jacqueline Côté. I'm the Director of Public Relations here at the Institute, and it's really my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Richard Baldwin. Richard is a professor of international economics and one of the oldest standing faculty member, I believe, was almost 30 years teaching here at the Institute. He's also the co-director of the Center on Trade and Economic Integration, one of the 9 research centers of the Institute. I can't start listing all of the leadership positions Richard has taken from the CEPR, the Center of Economic Policy Research, and Vox EU to other occupations such as the Global Agenda Council on Trade of the World Economic Forum. But apart from teaching, Richard has had some visiting professorships at leading universities, including with MIT, where he did his PhD way back under the supervision of Paul Krugman, with whom, incidentally, he has co-authored a number of articles. So Richard has, in the last few years, apart from fleeting around the world, written 2 great groundbreaking books. The first one, published in 2016, called The Great Convergence, Information Technology and the New Globalization, and latterly, just published a few weeks ago, The Globotics Upheaval, Globalization, Robotics, and the Future of Work. And we're going to hear more about that in a minute. But before I give him the floor, I would like to mention, for those of you who are interested in the topic of economic globalization and its impact on society, Richard has done a MOOC, this massive online course, which is free for everyone to attend. You can find the link on the page of this event on our website and learn more about this topic. So this is the first of our lunch briefing session series. You have more on this document, which you can take at the entrance and mark the date for others. As with all of our lunch briefing, we will have a presentation of roughly 20 minutes, though there are many slides to be seen, and then the floor will be given to the audience for a Q&A, and I intend to finish at 1:30 sharp. Richard, it's all over to you.
Well, thank you, Jacqueline, for that very generous introduction, and thanks, Ashayi, for giving this venue for me to sort of share my ideas. This is formally the European, actually we don't do book launches at the Graduate Institute, so this is not a book launch, but if it were, it would be the first one in Europe, and so this would be the European book launch. Tomorrow I'll do it in Brussels, and next week in London and Oxford. So let me start by why I wrote this book. And as many of you will know, when an author has to justify why he wrote his book, that's usually a book the world could have done without. And maybe you'll share that feeling at the end of the hour. But hang with me for another 20 minutes. I'm going to try and justify myself. So first of all, I want to say this book was going to be called something like The New Globalization. It was going to be a book on the future of globalization, because in presenting the 2016 book that Jacqueline mentioned, I had hundreds of conversations all over the world with all sorts of stakeholders and gathered an enormous amount of insights about what was going on. And I was just going to write up those conversations. But in doing the research, the background research, 3 things occurred to me that changed the course of the book and changed the title of the book. The first one is it's about services, not manufacturing. And in reading about the future of globalization and automation, I found a very, very systematic mixing up of what happened in globalization and automation in manufacturing in the last few decades and what's going to happen in the future. Even in something as careful as the book by McAfee and Brynjolfsson, The Second Machine Age, they will, almost in the same sentence, talk about industrial robots and software robots. And that's just a mistake, if not for no other reason that almost nobody works in the manufacturing sector anymore. There's 22 million office workers in the United States. There's only 9 million people in the entire production sector. The second is this discussion of, is it globalization or is it automation? Which in this particular case is completely confused, because globalization and automation are coming at the same time, driven by the same digital technology and affecting the same jobs. And it's happening faster than most people realize and in ways few people understand. Lastly, there is the second word in the title, upheaval, is because of this. People are angry, there's a fragility, there's an underlying discontent into which this digital disruption is being thrown. And in the book, I don't make firm predictions, but I do note that there is a significant possibility that this thing could become way more socially disruptive than most people are thinking about, because they're thinking it'll happen at the pace of the last 2 decades. So let's just get started with definitions. This I was so happy that they put that on. I was happy that it didn't get too big either, but you see here it says, Mamie en colère, and I got a picture from him, is Papi en rage. And you look here, there's different flags, they're not talking to each other, there's probably 10 different groups there. They don't know what they're mad about, and there's no leader, and there's no theme, but they're angry. And I think that's important to realize that this technological shock is coming into a social setting, social economic setting, that's totally different than the one that happened in the 90s or with China and all that sort of thing. Okay, Robotics, globalization plus robotics. I've had about 12, 15 reviews of the book now, and almost every single one of them went out of their way to say what an ugly word globotics was. And to me, it's like, yeah, that's right. I created that word to make you realize that it's not globalization or automation, it's both. It's digital technology driving globalization and robotics affecting service sector. Now, in general, I mean, the thing I want to talk about here is I think we've come to a state of history where there are really 2 very distinct processes of progress. So there's the one we're normally used to, where 5% or 10% growth per year or change per year, that's fast. And then there's another thing having almost anything to do with digital technology, where it doubles every 2 years. So our ability to process, store, transmit, and gather data doubles every 2 years, which means there is as much progress between when I finished the book in 2018 and 2020 as there was between the 1960s and when I finished the book. And that will happen every history doubles every 2 years. So it's a rate of progress, which, it'll eventually hit diminishing returns, but it's a rate of progress which is absolutely explosive. And it's changing many things, but we don't know what. So some things are affected, partly by digital technology, other things by the old physical constraints, and people are figuring out what's what. So that's part of it. When I talk about globalization here, without denying that there's lots of other globalizations, I'm talking about telemigration, which you can think of as international freelancing. And when I talk about robotics here, I'm talking about white-collar robots, not steel-collar robots. And I try and make a big difference between those in the book. And most of the reviews of my book, they were published with a picture of a physical robot next to it, even though one of the main points of my book is don't pay attention to the physical robots, because it's irresistible to put these up. So telemigration, people sitting in one nation working in an office of another. There's probably a number of French people in the audience who do that regularly. That's what I'm talking about, but just more. White-collar robots. This is at the low end. If you've never heard of robotic process automation, or RPA as they call it, you have to look at it. It's changing the world of work very rapidly, and it's getting bigger, faster. So this is what that robot looks like. That's a picture of the robot. It's a macro, basically. It's like a player piano. So let's say, I was in the States for 10 days and I send an email to Swisscom to tell them to change my subscription so I can get local calls under a different plan. A human will open up that email, decide what I want, open up the subscription, change my subscription, close that, open up the billing database and change that and shut it down. This thing does that exactly the same way using exactly the same software. It's like a player piano. It just does exactly what the human does in the same way, but 100 times faster with fewer mistakes, assuming it understood what I wanted, and it's all recorded. So in case something goes wrong, you can see what happened. This is the high end, white-collar robots high end. This is Amelia. She's an avatar associated with one of the high-end AI platforms that are doing lots and lots of things, especially a substitute for higher-end professional jobs. Now, Watson is one from IBM, and there's a dozen other ones where these not only have the gateway skills of reading, writing, talking, translating, that sort of stuff, they also can do more sophisticated things like look for fraud in the trucking department or diagnose skin cancer or stuff like that. So they're much higher end AI, and they're substituting more for professional jobs. I have a good story about Amelia there. She plays a big role in my book at the beginning, the middle, and the end. Okay, so what I'm not going to do is present the book. What I want to do is say some provocative things to get you going, because, of course, this is all about the Q&A, and for me, both for me and for you. So I'm going to get through this quickly. So what I want to do at this point is explain to you why I believe this time is different. And going through the literature and reading the surveys and people's findings, I was convinced that this isn't just more of the same old wine, new bottle stuff. This one's really different. So first of all, Digitech is advancing like ICT. So that was the first thing. I go like, okay, I wrote a book about ICT, information and communication technology, and that was driven by Moore's Law and stuff. But now everybody's talking about digital technology. So ICT, digital, is it the same thing? The answer is yes, it is exactly the same thing. But ICT, at least when it comes to globalization, was mostly applied to manufacturing. So it was mostly physical stuff and only a little bit of information and a little bit of communication that was sort of a facilitator to the same old stuff. Digitech is applied to services where it's mostly information and communication plus a little bit of physical. And what that means, a different type of physics applies. The old globalization, the old automation, was constrained by the laws of matter. The new globalization and the new automation is constrained by the laws that apply mostly to photons and electrons. And those are very, very different laws of physics that constrain the socioeconomic impact and its rate of change. So just imagine how long it takes to double flows of trade. The outside estimate would be 2 decades, because you have to build ports and cargo ships and factories and audiences and products. The flow of information across the borders has doubled every 2 years, the last 10 years going back, and probably will for the next 10 years going. So if you're judging how fast this stuff is likely to come in the next 2 years, by looking at what happened in the last 2 years in manufacturing, you are making a serious mistake because you're using the wrong type of physics. What's new about today's AI? In 2019, computers can read, write, see, speak, understand speech, create visual output, recognize subtle patterns. The only thing they can't do is speak as fast as me. In 2015, they couldn't. So what changed? And when I thought about this, I looked and did a lot of researching, and this is how I think about it. It's the programming. So many of you will have seen this book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, by Dan Kahneman, who's won a Nobel Prize. And he points out, something that psychiatrists have known for long, is that humans have 2 systems for thinking. One is slow, and that's like when you're in New York City and trying to figure out an 18% tip on a restaurant bill. That's slow, you know you're doing it, it's effortful, it's conscious, and most importantly, you know how you do it. Therefore, you can write a computer program that teaches a computer to do it. Up until very recently, say 2016, that's how we taught computers to do things. We wrote down code, which told them every logical step to take in every possible situation. Therefore, we could only teach them to do thinking slow mental tasks. Since 2016, they're using machine learning to, in essence, program computers, which means you get a huge structured data set where the question is clear and the outcome is clear, and you estimate an enormous statistical model with various algorithms, but at the end of it, it's just a piece of programming code where you put in an input and out comes some output. But because we're programming in different ways, we can teach it to think fast. We can teach it to walk and talk and translate, understand language, do all these sorts of things. And just exactly like humans, we don't know how that model is doing it. So it's so complex and so nonlinear, you can't actually figure out why this algorithm knows that this is a cat and that's a dog. You can't identify that, just like we can't identify it. Faster than expected. One of the amazing things about this digital stuff is it's predictable but unexpected all the time. They even have a name for it, digital disruption. So all the time people know about Moore's Law, they know about how fast this is going and has been going, but they get taken by surprise. So I was trying to think in my own mind to construct a way of thinking about that. How is it possible that it's predictable but unexpected? This is what I came up with. So think about progress on the vertical axis and years on the horizontal axis, and I'm going to assert that humans instinctively think about progress this way. People ask, how likely is it that we'll have self-driving cars in another 2 or 3 years? And of course, you can't calculate that. It's too many unknowns. So you use your gut, your instinct. And your instinct says, well, I'll look back and see what happened in the last 2 years, and I'll think the increment of change in the future will be like the increment of change in the past, more or less, because our brains evolved in a walking distance world. And that was a useful thing, a linear approximation. But that's not how digital technology works. Digital technology actually progresses according to an exponential curve. And what that means is that in the early stage, humans are overestimating the impact of technology. And people like me sound alarmist. So I read about digital technology, oh, all the jobs are going to change, and oh yeah, we heard this before. But afterwards, our instinctive thinking underestimates the impact of technology, and that's what I like to call the holy cow moment. It's when digital leaders get disrupted. I'm glad you guys like that one. I really worked a long time on the holy cow. And I worried about, anyways, never mind. So that's digital disruption. So we overestimate to start with, and we underestimate. There's actually a name for that. It's called Amaras Law. Okay, job displacement is the business model. That's why this is different. This is not a new technology which is creating jobs and displacing jobs. All the AI geniuses are using digital technology to replace worker. That's how they're going to become billionaires in the next 2 or 3 years. So they're all designing it to replace workers. They're not using it to create jobs. There's some ancillary creation, but the business model is displacing jobs. And the job displacement is the business model of the AI geniuses and driven at the pace of digital technology, which is explosive. Job creation is driven by human ingenuity and entrepreneurship, which will eventually create all the jobs we need, but progresses at a very different pace. And it is a mismatch of the displacement and creation which causes the trouble, not the forward. So I'm optimistic in the long run, a little worried in the short run. It's coming in ways few expect. So first of all, think tasks, not occupations. Many jobs will go, but few occupations. One of the things I found quite systematic in this literature is that the journalist or whoever, economists, business people, write about AI as if it's kind of like a junior doctor. So there's a robo-doctor that diagnoses childhood disease, and they sort of talk about it like it's a doctor in kindergarten, and so it can only do some things. But eventually it'll grow up, graduate from high school, and become just like a doctor, and therefore replace a doctor. And I've had, last week, I had a journalist rather aggressively asking me, of these 4 professions, which will still be here in 5 years? And the answer, all of them. Because you shouldn't think about AI as like a baby reporter or lawyer or doctor. You should think about it like a tractor. And you don't think of a tractor like a baby farmer who now can only do some things, but just give it enough time and it'll be able to replace the whole farmer. No, a tractor is a very specific tool which changed the nature of the job of farming. and meant we needed fewer farmers to do the same food, but it isn't going to grow up and completely become a farmer. And that's a big mixed perception in my mind. Think service and professional jobs, not manufacturing jobs. These guys have known about automation and globalization for a couple decades. They're all over it. Robots at home, China abroad, nothing we can teach them. These people feel sorry for these people, but it's coming for their jobs now. Both the automation and the globalization, and the upheaval part of my book is if a significant fraction of those people lose their job in the next few years, they may join forces with these people, and we may have a gilet jaune generalized. It won't look like Janesville. Many of you have read the book about this factory that closed in a small town in Wisconsin, human tragedy, suicides, all that sort of stuff, won a lot of awards. But what I wanted to point out is that in the manufacturing sector, you know when globalization and automation comes, they close a factory. And then you only have to figure out, was it China or was it the robots? That's not how it's going to happen in the service sector. It's going to happen more like this. You recognize this? Any of you been at a table like this? Okay. So these smartphones have infiltrated our lives, our communities, our workplaces, our families, our social lives. But 7 or 8 years ago, this thing was a mediocre phone with a short battery life, a very good music player, and a web browser that wasn't much good because there wasn't much wireless. That was it, 3 things. But one innovation at a time, one convenience at a time, it started coming into our lives, changing the way we interact with the cities we live in, changing the way we work, changing our social lives, changing how we pay for things. But here's the thing. Nobody asked that to happen. It just happened. And in the same way, I think telemigration and white-collar robots will come into our workplaces due to seemingly unrelated decisions, each one very small, but after just 4 or 5 years, maybe even 2 or 3 years, we'll look back and say, how did we ever get along without them? So it will be an infiltration of our lives, not a decision to do things. Future of work. I have 2 minutes to do the future of work. Fortunately, the future's not very long. I don't look very far into the future here. Okay, so first of all, the good news, new jobs will appear as they have before. By my count, there's been 2 very large transformations of economies. One that Polanyi called the Great Transformation from about 1700 up to, I would say, 1973, when people went from farms to factories. So the green farm jobs are going down, factory jobs are going up along with services. Everybody found a job eventually. And then we moved from the factory to the offices in what I call the service transformation, and everybody found a job eventually, or most of them found a job eventually. So the jobs in the end is I think, a false red herring that we'll all be unemployed. We've heard that story before. It didn't happen before. It probably won't happen this time. But that doesn't mean we know what those jobs will be. And I would point out that we can't know what those jobs would be. So when these guys were leaving the farm and going to the factory, they had no idea what they would be making. They had never heard of pharmaceuticals or electric fans or cars. But they knew they'd be working in a factory. And they knew more or less what kind of skills they would need. And society's changed the entire elementary schooling system to prepare them for those jobs, even though they didn't know what those jobs actually would be. And the same thing, when people went from factories to offices, they were doing services that they didn't even know about. Telecoms wasn't a thing. There was no web browsers. There was no search engine optimization jobs, etc. But we had a pretty good idea what skills you would need in those new jobs. That meant more education to get ready for those. Now, going forward, what I think is this is the way to think about it. Globots will do what they can. So artificial intelligence, remote intelligence, whatever they can do, since they're much cheaper, they will do the tasks. We will do what the Globots can't. So whatever those jobs are of the future, it will be things that AI and RI is remote intelligence, cannot do. So thinking about the future, we should stop fascinating about what AI can do and start thinking about what it can't do and why. So, what can't AI do? Here, machine learning is the jet engine, but big data is the jet fuel. Structured data is the key limitation. So if you want to know what tasks white-collar robots are not going to be able to do in the next 5 years, look for parts of your job that couldn't possibly be put into a big spreadsheet in Excel where it goes, this is what we were deciding, this is what we decided. They get 1 million of those, and very soon an AI robot will do it better than you can. But lots of the things in your own job, the question's never clear. You know, you come into a staff meeting, it's not clear what the question is. In fact, often it's not clear what the outcome was, but we've made progress. Now, that's something that's very, very human, and you can't get a structured database. Or, for example, how did you motivate people to do things? Or how did you adjust them to changes? There are no big data sets on that, so that's what we'll be doing. There's more formally a McKinsey study that goes through this. And approximately speaking, if you squint your eyes, it's the most human task that AI can't do. Ethics, applying empathy, innovating, dealing with unknown situations, motivating people, managing large groups of people, understanding what people are thinking. Those are the things that AI won't be able to do in the next few years. Therefore, the jobs of the future will involve lots of that because the robots will do the other stuff. What can't RI do? Well, the only thing that telemigrants can't do is be in the room because they are humans. They are telemigrating. So the jobs of the future that are left will involve jobs where you actually have to be in the room with other humans or some piece of equipment. So the jobs of the future will be more human and more local jobs, will be richer and more generous societies, so it's like very good. The future's very good. We'll have nice jobs, we'll have more local community. The trouble is we have to manage the transition, and that's where the second word in the title comes, upheaval. I'm worried about that one. So I'll just stop right there. Thank you very much. A little bit over, sorry.
No, that's good.
Which one do you want? Okay.
Well, thank you, Richard. I guess if you can't beat them, you have to join them. So there's a sense of urgency and the sense that we need to do something both at the individual level and at the collective level, at the country level. So I know you couldn't cover everything in your book, and I must confess I haven't read your book cover to cover. But
it came out last week, so you're somewhat excused.
Okay, thank you. But for the young generation here, it's not just a question of transition, it's how can they individually prepare themselves?
So the book is not about policy reaction, but I do have a section at the end about what to do. And this, we didn't coordinate this, but this gives me a chance to talk about Amelia, the very presentational robot, the healthy, confident-looking avatar that's associated with one of these AI platforms. Now, that platform is done by IPsoft, and as avatars are, there is a real woman behind the avatar. It's a model, and her name is Amanda. And as a publicity stunt, IPsoft had Amanda and Amelia on the same stage. Actually, the thing is, you can't help but say her when you look at Amelia, but it's not. It's like an Excel spreadsheet on a screen. So you had the screen with the program running, and you had Amanda, the real human there, and they had a quiz show. Who do you think won? Amanda did, because it was general questions and in English. Now, Amelia was first trained to help people open bank accounts in Sweden. And if the questions had been about opening bank accounts and in Swedish, Amanda would have been crushed. So basically, that's how you should think about how to prepare yourself. What could Amelia be trained to do? Don't invest in that. What would Amanda win? Invest in that. Or sort of another way of thinking about it is that the old rules of get more skills in education, that's way too blunt. Because machine learning is essentially database pattern recognition, which sounds a lot like many of your jobs, which are experience-based pattern recognition. And if you spend many, many years at university learning to be experienced at pattern recognition, whatever it is, that's probably a bad idea. So my guess is shorter, more human skills. Everybody needs to have the digital technology. I mean, everybody needs to know how to use digital technology. That's table stakes, like learning English in the old days. But beyond that, managing people, being innovative, being ethical, providing empathy, those things I think are going to be far, far more important. So I think here at the Graduate Institute, we do it already. Lots of group presentations, lots of group work. You know, that's the reality. I was at Cisco, I was at Davos a couple weeks ago, and I was talking with the chief people person of Cisco, who employs, she manages 72,000 employees. And she said they have stopped evaluating workers individually. They evaluate project by project, and then they have. So in essence, this idea that you'll be in, you know, you take an exam and you get an A or a B and the person next to you doesn't, that's kind of moving away in the real world. You have to work as a team, and they figured out, obviously, there's good people and bad people, but so teamwork, empathy, creativity, inventiveness.
Thank you very much. Now, the floor is yours. Yes, one question here. This one.
No, well, how do I collect?
Thank you, Richard. I can perfectly understand that jobs will be displaced before new jobs will be created, and there's a mismatch there. Now, the point is, you can replace workers with AI, but how will you replace demand? Is there a role that you're imagining for fiscal policy there, or how can you keep the economy running if you're replacing demand? You're not replacing demand, you're replacing jobs, but demand will fall. So what's your view there?
We're going to gather a couple questions, if
Yeah,
that's okay.
I'll take a second question.
Say's Law, by the way, that's my answer.
Gentleman there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So the patterns of kind of transition from farm to factory and then from factory to office that you showed often took place over periods of maybe centuries or decades. What are the disruptive cycles in terms of jobs going to look like for this generation entering the job market? And then you talked about some of the micro policy responses in terms of what individuals or individual companies can do, but what's the kind of macro level governmental response that you think would be appropriate in this context? Thank you.
Right.
Okay, and a third question there. We'll go on the second.
Thank you so much. For this concept, most of the time the conversations within the policy community are geared towards the future of work, but not too many people are talking about the future of education and the future of safety nets. From that policy angle, I'm wondering which insights you may have in these particular things, and also how the policy community needs to strengthen the combination of soft skills, which you mentioned, empathy, creativity, and so on, with the appropriate technical skills to be successful and competitive in this the fourth industrial revolution. Thank you.
Right. So let me take those two questions together because they're somewhat related, the macro response on that. So your question, comment answered a lot, and I agree with that. We will have to reorient education in a serious way. Personally, I think it may be happening so fast that it's way too late. I mean, it's never too late, but people are going to have to adjust without having changed the degree requirements and all those things. But I think more general, shorter educational things and continual retraining is important. I think that's obviously plan A, is this disruption should be allowed to go ahead and the government should help people adjust. That's plan A, that governments look after workers, not jobs, like in Denmark or something, and we're going to need more of that. But fundamentally, I don't think there's anything new to be done. People will have to change jobs like they have had to do over the last 3 centuries, just perhaps faster. But on the other hand, this will mostly be service jobs to service jobs, which have, at least in the past, proven easier to do. And then I'm going to just come quickly to your question, that I think, at least in the short run, this will look a lot more like the 50-year-old factory workers who had to take a a lower paid job in the skilled sector, in the service sector. And so there won't be mass unemployment in my view, but people's salary will go down. I'll come back to the UBI, which I guess is where you're getting to in a second. Now on the macro response. So the macro response, I think deep down, is the governments have to stand ready to slow it down. We don't know. I mean, I didn't do any original research in this book. I just read all the things. And if you look at some of the experts, they're saying tens of millions of jobs spread over 10 years, in which case, no big deal. You know, in the US, they destroy and create 5 million jobs per month. So 10 million is nothing. Some people say hundreds of millions over 5 years in automation alone, and other tens or hundreds of millions in telemigration in 5 or 10 years. If that's the case, the Gilets jaunes will all be here, and we will have a problem, like socially destructive problem, like LA riots or the Mayfair riots they had in London in the 1980s. There is the possibility of a sort of generalized backlash. So we don't know what, and in the future we can't know, but I think governments should be ready to slow it down. And then there's really two options. The first, which is already happening, I call shelterism in the book. And that is people don't oppose the technological change or the telemigrating. They just want a little shelter from the storm. And they use existing regulations, health, safety, environment, and generally, above all, privacy regulations, to slow down the adoption of the technology. And my analogy is Uber. So wherever taxi drivers are sufficiently powerful, they have used existing regulations to slow down the implementation of the technology, and I think we'll see that again and again all across. That may or may not be good enough. If it's not good enough, then there is the nuclear option. And ultimately people say you can't slow down digital technology, there's no way to stop it. And that's true, but irrelevant. Nobody actually cares about the technology. They care about the economic implication of that technology on their lives. Now, every advanced economy in the world has rules about firing workers, including the United States. And they have strict ones, they have different types, sometimes it's by price, sometimes by control, but every government controls the firing of people. And if they made it harder to fire people, the firms would adopt the technology at a slower pace, because they're adopting the technology primarily to let workers go. So that's the nuclear option. When we start seeing LA riots in many cities, or we see the Battle of Seattle spread around the world, and we have to slow it down in an emergency, we can. We have those tools. You just make it very hard for anybody to fire anybody for any reason, and that will calm the whole thing down. We'll have horrible consequences, and we'll pay for it decades, as you can see with, say, Spanish unemployment or the places where this unemployment protection is bad. But we could slow it down if we have to, and I think at the macro level, that's really the only thing the governments can do at this moment, is stand ready to slow it down if it becomes socially explosive. All right, UBI, okay. So this is the question of how will people get the money to buy the things the robots make? And then the answer is universal basic income. So somehow or another we're going to tax rich people and then give it to people and then they can buy and the demand recycles. Well, first of all, I think a lot of that is coming from thinking about manufactured goods, where the robots actually do make goods. You put them on trucks, they come into the store, and you go like, who's going to buy them? But in the service sector, the act of production and the act of consumption are often the same act. So when you provide the service, there is somebody there consuming the service at the same time. So in the service sector, the possibility for slippage between supply and demand, I think, is systematically less. But in any case, to me, I'm not worried about the macro of this. I'm really only looking out 3, 4, 5 years, and I think the next slowdown will look like a standard recession, not something else. So we could talk all day long about UBI, but that's where I stand on it.
Okay, next 3 rounds. This lady, then this gentleman, and over there.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. 2 short questions. First one, is there a way to actually distribute the remaining and upcoming jobs more evenly so that we can actually enjoy, all of us, 2 or 3 hours work per day, and then the rest will be free time, rather than creating mass unemployment and the rest of the society like working crazily for 15 or 20 hours per day and have, you know, they are always busy, nothing, you know, when you ask them something, they don't have time, you know, for you. The second question is, what is going to be the impact of all of these changes on environmental degradation? This is very important because, you know, the resources are finite at the end of the day. So how about resource competition and environmental degradation?
Thank you. So the job distribute, oh yes, I'm sorry, you're right, absolutely.
This gentleman here?
Your metaphor about the tractor and the farmer is double-edged because indeed the engine, the machinery did replace the farmer, except for one thing, ownership. The farmer is still the owner of the land, of the cattle, of the grain. In the industry, the ownership, what does a worker own, is more dizzy. And in services, what is that ownership which will make the human still the winner, the eventual winner of the game?
And there was, no other raised hands?
Thanks. Following up on your discussion about the macroeconomic, macro approaches, how do you see trade fitting in? Do you see use for barriers to trade in services, use for barriers in trade on e-commerce, or would that just compound some of the international distributional effects?
Thank you for that. Okay, distribution of jobs, I don't think we have enough time to do that. I mean, it's now. I mean, I think this will enter into the 2020 elections and be a big issue. So there's already a candidate named Andrew Yang who's running on an anti-tech platform. You should watch his videos. Like, I've shown it to people and they go like, oh, I'd vote for him. He's not going to win. He's basically trying to sell books, which I can understand. But he's redirecting the anger and fragility away from foreigners and towards tech. And I'm quite sure that the left-leaning Democratic candidates like Bernie Sanders will pick up on that because big tech is so easy to hate. Now, the adjustments eventually for like shorter hours, 35 weeks, 38 weeks, whatever, I think that's going to happen and just a continuation. But it's so difficult to do that. So I don't think that's going to happen in the short run. But probably should happen in the long run. You know, this will be like the long run, it's like Downtown Abbey where all the work's done by robots. You know, we all get up at 10 o'clock and decide whether to have a glass of sherry or gin and tonic and, you know, ride the horses, give some yoga classes, you know, we'll all be divorce lawyers or yoga teachers or, you know, something like that. So that would be a wonderful thing, but we don't have time for that right now. That's what I would say. The environmental thing, I didn't go into that at all. My kind of guess is that this is actually good for the environment because transmission is replacing trade to a certain extent. Things are made locally. The service sector is, generally speaking, way greener, and I'm suggesting that jobs will be way more local. So but that's just off the top of my head. You should realize what free advice is worth. The tractor and the farmer, you know, I would disagree that the farmer is only owning the things, and I think if you ask the farmers in the Canton de Genève if all they do is own the stuff, I think they might disagree. But let me take that in a slightly different question, which is the ownership of the robots, which is what some people say we should switch from capitalism to robotism, because the guys who own the robots are going to control everything. And I think that's a systematic this isn't your misunderstanding, but I think there is a systematic misunderstanding that we're talking about steel-colored robots where they are actually somewhere. You know, they're here and somebody owns them. What we're talking about is software. So it'd be like saying, who owns the Excel spreadsheets? That's like a nonsensical question. You can make as many as you want. They can be in the cloud and be anywhere. It's not really clear who owns them. It would be impossible to tax them. So I think that ownership question is going to change. I think it's going to go more towards knowledge. And that's an incomplete answer, but I don't have a better one. Trade. I'm talking about a very large, since it's a technical audience, includes some WTO people, I'm talking about a relatively large increase in Mode 1 services trade, basically. That's what I'm talking about. I don't think, I think machine translation will stimulate trade in goods, but that's like a trade facilitation, but technological. On the trade, I think there'll be two big issues that come up: taxation and labor standards. So this telemigration will, I think, occur to many people as incredibly unfair, because the telemigrants won't pay taxes locally, probably won't pay taxes in their own country, and may pay taxes nowhere, and will probably need some sort of international agreement to make sure that they get taxed somewhere and it feels fair. And the second is labor standards. So my guess is we'll have a Nike-like sweatshop labor scandal soon enough, where turns out that there is 12-year-old girls chained in to their chairs in a factory in Outer Mongolia, tagging photos at incredibly low wages. And somebody will say, how can you do this? So there are no standards, there are no taxation, and that, I think, will be an issue. The good news is that most of it is coming through platforms like Upwork and Mechanical Turk and Freelancer. There's a platform competition going on. So when I was at Davos, I talked to the CEO of Upwork, Stephanie Kesserel, and I asked him about this tax thing. And he says, well, any US-based freelancer, we issue a 1099, which is a tax form for miscellaneous income. And we would do that with any country that asks, but most of the countries don't ask. So there are a lot of people doing Upwork and freelancing in Sri Lanka, but the Sri Lankan government doesn't even ask Upwork to report their income. So I think there's ways to fix it, and my guess, the way to go forward is a rule of good conduct among the platforms to address some of these issues. I don't know if I addressed your question, but I did talk a little bit about trade. So.
But Richard, to come back to the taxation of robots, there's a whole discussion on that, but I presume it's only the physical robots. But couldn't you conceive with the software that sort of the license would include a part that is a tax element that goes back to the government?
Yeah.
Is there something that could be worked out there to actually pay for this disruption?
Yeah, so you could, if it's done on a license, there could be some taxation of that sort of thing. But some of these are now, in the RPA, is gone to freeware. So Work Fusion, for example, is free. It's like Linux. It's free online, and people implement it. So there's no particular license associated with it. But I'm not saying there's no solutions. But what I wanted to point out is a lot, like when Gates said tax the robots, he had in mind industrial robots. And they're just like a capital good. But a lot of this software robot, it's not clear where it is. It's not clear how you tax it. It's not clear that people wouldn't, put it in the cloud in Bermuda and therefore avoid the taxation. So it's just I think it is a problem.
Okay, we still have time for a few questions. Maybe this lady and then this gentleman.
Now my students are starting to raise their hands. That's good.
Good for the students.
Okay, thank you so much for your your presentation. I just had one question, and it's on from a developing country perspective. With things like telemigration, do you think that this will actually foster more premature deindustrialization, as more and more workers will be freelancing and doing service jobs from developing countries for tasks in developed countries? Thank you.
Okay, and there was another. Yeah, over there.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about the two different types of, physics-based, matters and electrons. But a lot of your electrons are based on finite resources that are going to become extinct in the next decade. Things like silver, zinc, cobalt, et cetera, et cetera. How realistic is this future and all the tech-driven innovation that we've been hearing, like blockchain, et cetera, that requires massive computing and these raw materials?
Okay, and one last question on this side, and then we'll turn to this side for the next round. So, no, it was the man in the back, or the woman in the back?
Who?
Can't see.
Oh, there, back
Person
there.
in the back, please.
Thank you very much. So my question was about, so I have the impression that currently, like, unemployment is not only about education, so some jobs disappear, maybe people might have to requalify, but also about places, like people are not necessarily always mobile for various reasons, like family and so on. So I was wondering if the technological developments might create some jobs which maybe require people to reskill a little bit, or maybe accept a lower wage, but will enable them to stay living in the place where they currently are, or whether it will all go to the places that are the cheapest, or will there be both types of telework, some that maybe just goes to the cheapest places because you need very few skills, maybe some you need a mid-level of skills that can be done also in more expensive places? Thank you.
Okay. So first question is the impact on development or emerging markets. And the book is very much written for rich countries. And I sort of feel like I'm going down to the village square and ringing the bell and say, wake up, things are going to happen faster than you imagine, and people are totally misthinking it. So it's the rich countries where we're going to have the upheaval, not the poor countries, I think. So that's why I wrote that book. But I do get asked these questions fairly frequently, and I have done a little thinking about it. So, and without, harmonizing and putting it all together, these are some thoughts which are going to sound a lot like a couple anecdotes strung together as if they meant something. So, first of all, deindustrialization. This is all about services, not industry. Now, AI in general, and IT in general, are causing problems for industrialization of middle-income developing countries, because it's in essence automating a lot of the steps in the standard development ladder. As it turns out, so for some reason or another, you can't sew with robots yet. So sewing, like in Bangladesh, that you still actually need humans to do it. They're working on it, but so far that. But then the next step up requires a level of skills and machinery which aren't really appropriate. So it used to be you'd start with textile and apparels, and then furniture, and so the light industries, and then you go up to the heavy industries, and then the high-tech industries. And automation of manufacturing has kind of kicked out the middle steps, so it's hard to get from here to there. And that's a very important thing in development, and the World Bank has written a report called Trouble in the Making, which looks at those problems, and I do think that's a problem. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about service automation and service outsourcing. And there I think it's actually a plus. So I believe that the emerging market miracle will continue and spread. So if you think about the emerging market miracle up till now, this is a big story. This is one of the stories in my last book. Basically, it was all manufacturing. And it was very closely related to the outsourcing and manufacture of jobs, because when the G7 firms outsourced the jobs, they sent the technology along with it. Marketing, managerial, technical know-how, and thereby taught countries like China to produce goods they couldn't possibly have produced with their own technology. And some of the countries have then, it started the engine, and they're going on their own fuel. But for them, it was all about manufacturing, and it was know-how going from the rich countries to the poor countries, causing rapid industrialization, rapid income, and that causes a commodity super cycle, and it brought along some commodity exporting countries. So that was the emerging market miracle, which had a very important feature, that it was in very few countries. So this manufacturing actually happened in a big way in like 6 or 7 countries. They tended to be nearby the other countries, because manufacturing is subject to enormous agglomeration economies. And you need a port and rails, and you need minimum education. So it was really concentrated in a few. Telemigration is a completely different type of export. But ultimately, it's driven by the same thing, which is controlling for quality. People in emerging markets are very cheap. And before, the only way you could exploit that comparative advantage, that's their superpower in the world of competition, is control for quality, they're cheap. The only way you could do that would by make a good and send the good across the border. This is allowing you to send skills across the border directly. And this service outsourcing is super micro. If you look at, like, say, Upwork, there's some data and stuff. It's very frequently very small companies hiring individuals or very small companies. So it's micro. And therefore, it's dispersed. And my guess is that we'll go by time zones. My guess is that Africa will provide a lot of these services to Europe, South America to North America, and Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia. That's my guess. And it'll start with middle-income people in middle-class people in middle-income countries. Middle class because they have skills that we actually recognize. The doctors and dentists and bookkeepers and travel agents, and they have skills they do in their country, which we would buy in our country for the right price. So that's where it'll start. And also they have the connectivity. And middle-income countries, because they need bank accounts to get paid. They need internet connectivity. They need to be able to afford a laptop. And in middle-income countries, there's lots of those things. The poorest countries not. So I think the poorest countries will be left out of this. But generally speaking, it will be a good idea. In essence, it's a huge export opening to them. Now, let me take one more swing at this. You can see I thought hard about having a chapter in the book, but I didn't actually do it. Think about what trade and services is. Trade and services, like everything else, is an arbitrage. You're trying to make things where they're cheap and sell them where they're more expensive. That's what business does. And the really big price differences in the world are wages of service providers in the world. They're often 10 to 1. But they weren't traded because of barriers. But these barriers were technical barriers, not for the most part, man-made barriers. So, you can't practice law or medicine across borders, but a huge amount of services aren't regulated at that level. And the digital technology is bringing down that barrier, and not slowly. It's, every year, you can think like it was 1,000% tariff, technology brings it to 500, to 250, to et cetera, like this. And it's coming down very, very fast, opening up an export opportunity for cheap labor in developing countries. So I think we'll see a whole bunch of new emerging market miracles that look a lot more like India than China, where it was done on service exports. Okay. Raw materials. So, the exponential curve goes like this, but if the original version of that, which was more complicated, it's a logistics curve, because you do eventually hit diminishing returns and you start running out of stuff. And I don't believe at all with this singularity, stuff that, that everything's going to change, because we will run into physical constraints. And we're right now in the sharp part of the S curve, but it will kind of go like that. But I'm worried about the next 3 to 5 years, where I don't think we'll run out of wire or fibers. Eventually, it will be a big issue, but not right away. Unemployment, skills, also the place. That was your question. So one of the reasons I feel so confident of predicting that telemigration will grow quickly is because it's grown so quickly domestically. So in the United States, we don't have terrible statistics, but there's some surveys and things. The amount of people who are working remotely is huge and growing fast. And one of the reasons they do it is because service providers in big cities like New York and Chicago can't hire the talent because the talent can't afford the housing. So a lot of the outsourcing and the remote work is actually done inside the United States in low-cost areas and providing it. So I do think that will be an element of it. The trouble is that once they work out the collaborative softwares and the hardware, they'll figure out that people in North Dakota are 10 times more expensive than the people in Colombia. And so I worry about that very much. Is that everybody? Yeah, that's everybody.
Yes, unfortunately, we won't have much time for many other questions, but if I can just ask one last question.
Absolutely.
What happens if the internet explodes? Like we have a Chinese internet and a Russian internet. Does all of this, what's the impact of all of that?
Right. Somebody should write a book about that. So first of all, don't say if, it's happening. If you look at online commercial services, there's a Chinese world and there's a Western world, and they are separate. If you look at connections, what's happening in China is Russia's trying to reproduce. So it seems likely, and I was talking with Michael Kennedy here, and he says that's already starting to happen, and probably like GDPR, the European one, you're not supposed to send it to countries who don't protect the data. That by itself could start to lead to what they call the splinter net. So it was one of the big themes at Davos, 5G, Huawei, data privacy, all that what wraps up into a separation of the digital world. But what, we don't know. And still, it won't be the old Cold War, but it'll be something else. So I think it's a fascinating new topic. But when I came away from Davos this year, the thing was, read more about 5G, because it's way bigger than you think, and it's way more complicated. It's also not a thing, it's a kind of a concept. So I will leave it with that.
So if your last book took a year to write, the next book will take half the time?
Well, I have robots, and I actually am hiring remote intelligence to help me with the books. So.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your great
Thank you very much.
presentation.
Thank you. That was very nice.